Good morning, everyone. It's Niigaan, and I'm very glad that you are here with me. I'm up very early here in just outside of Bad River Indian Reserve in Wisconsin, and just on the border between Michigan and Wisconsin in northern Michigan, just on the near Madeline Island in one of the Great Lakes. And here I am at ceremonies with my family. And as you can tell, this is a recording. And I'm glad all of you can join us for today for the final session in our series. We've been going for an entire year. This is the ninth, should have been 10, but you remember that I had to cancel a few weeks back. Ninth session of our series to talk a little bit about what it is that we're thinking about when we start to work with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge. And that is what we're going to finish off for today. You've had a chance to send Joan questions, any questions from the series that we've done. So here we are. And I've got a whole bunch of questions, got over 20 questions. And so I'll try to get to all of them for today, but I do have to head over to the lodge this morning. So I've gotten up extra early. We've got a big work day ahead of us. So what we are doing right now is we are building the lodge together as a community. We have two lodges. We have our teaching lodge and then our initiation lodge. And so we have people that have been working for an entire year to initiate into our community, into our society. And so what you do during that year is you learn songs and stories and you sit with teachings with our elders and work on your language and work on different aspects of yourself. And then that whole year is culminated in a very special ceremony that is done by very high esteemed elders who join together and work to bring people into a very important healing process in which they then work on elements of themselves or commit to elements of themselves to help others. And that's what we do. We then go out into the world and we help others. And that's actually one of the answers to the questions that I saw earlier. So I'm going to save that for that question and let's get going. So as we've talked about, these questions or these sessions that I've been doing for you are intended to give you a sense of understanding of what it is like to work with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous perspectives and different ways that Indigenous peoples view this place, the world, North America. And so, you'll hopefully get a sense of some of that knowledge in all of this, but we're not intending to be exhaustive. I don't speak for all Indigenous peoples. I really just speak for not even my nation. There's many different nations amongst the Anishinaabe. So, for example, you may be hearing in just near you, in the Mississauga of the New Credit, there's a group of Anishinaabe people, for example, that just recently invited and met with and had a gathering with, a ceremony with people from Israel. And which, in the context of the current situation in the Middle East and some of the conflict that's taking place there, it's a little odd, but it's also important to realize that while many Anishinaabe people, I would say the vast majority of Anishinaabe people are calling for a ceasefire and certainly are not supportive of many of the actions that's been taking place over the past little while. There are some Anishinaabe that do support Israel and Israel's actions. And so if you want to know what I think, I've been writing about this in the Winnipeg Free Press, and so I invite you to read my pieces. I'm not here to tell you how to think on that issue. I would just say that the vast majority of Anishinaabe people are not supportive of the harming of families, women, and children, no matter what the reasoning is. So But that's a good point to start for today, is to say that I don't speak for all Anishinaabe people. I don't speak for all Indigenous people. I just speak for myself, and I just speak for the expertise that I bring to this topic, to these issues, to this perspective. I grew up in ceremony, so I've been in ceremony for almost 42 years. And I don't even speak for the expertise on ceremonies. I just speak from my experience. But I do have 40 plus years, and I also have, of course, my entire life of being Anishinaabe and working with Anishinaabe communities and families. And so what I would just say is that I speak for myself and my own experience, and what you'll do is you'll maybe speak to another Anishinaabe person or Indigenous person, and you'll realize, oh, there's different perspectives on these things and ideas. And all I would say to that is exactly, as Indigenous peoples, that's what we do in ceremony, is we bring different ideas together, different perspectives, different paths together, and we try to find a way that we can work together, a way that we can move forward and commit to each other as peoples who come from those different directions. And so we have a phrase for that. We call that Niigaan Sinclair, and for all the things that have brought us to this place, we now try to move forward, or we're joyous that we have an opportunity to do that. So Niigaan Sinclair. So that's what I'll be doing for today. So I'll be sort of talking a little bit about my perspective of things. So I'm going to shrink that screen and move to another one here. So the first question that I have is, it says, in no particular order, these are the ones I got. So, and thanks to Joan for collecting all of these for you. First question, I saw somewhere that the Neskantaga First Nation community was evacuated to Thunder Bay after 9,300 days without clean water. Is this real? It is absolutely real. In fact, they've eclipsed 10,000 days now. They started a boil water advisory in February of 1995. And there's a whole set of reasons why that is. Mostly it has to do with development, and more recently, the Ring of Fire development. Neskantaga is one of 3 First Nations that's been impacted by that development. And while the government of Ontario is seeking the resources within that area, and particularly the energy that's possible to be able to be extracted so that Ontarians can have the abundant wealth in that area, just like nearby Attawapiskat. All of the things that can be taken of value in that area. Meanwhile, the First Nations that actually live there sit in dire poverty, have their own value taken from them, and they're left in a bloody mess. Neskantaga First Nation has been impacted with having thousands of days without clean water and been on a boil water advisory. And every once in a while, that situation becomes an emergency, particularly in the ways in which it's a fly-in community, right? So particularly in the ways in which, let's say, a forest fire happens and there's limited ability to bring in fresh water. And so then people would have to be evacuated. There are people there that continue to live, and of course live in that place and continue to struggle for the ability to maintain a livelihood in that space. And this is really what that question is about. The question is, why is this happening? Why is it that there is First Nations? And indeed, when the federal government came in, this federal Liberal government came in, there's over 130 boil water advisories, and that's been reduced to about a third of that. So this federal government has been successful in treating Indigenous peoples like human beings. We should not be calling this reconciliation, because it's not. Reconciliation is like working together, benefiting together. Reconciliation is not treating people like human beings. So the federal Liberal government has just started to treat people like human beings, which is better than the previous Conservative and Liberal governments who did not treat Indigenous peoples like human beings and continued to chronically neglect, underfund the infrastructure on those First Nations, and frankly, just not care, just don't care. And that's what the consecutive federal governments for decades, we're talking about the governments of Pierre Trudeau, Brian Mulroney, Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin, Stephen Harper, These are all governments who just didn't care, who absolutely only cared about one thing and one thing only, and that's the resources that could be extracted from that area. And that results in boil water advisories, people who don't have clean drinking water in their homes, who then have to use bottled water or boil water that comes out of their faucets in order to drink or to use for a bath or to wash their child or to make food. The fact is that this is an atrocious situation that you'd expect to hear in certain areas in the world that perhaps are considered third world. No, they often call First Nations, by the way, fourth world conditions, which is kind of the most atrocious, meaning that you have the abundant wealth around you, but you just outright refuse to give it. In third world conditions, it's almost like a sort of unifying method, because then everybody in that region has a lack of access. In the fourth world conditions, the most disgusting is that the people right next door or right just a few miles away have absolute access, and they just simply refuse to share that access with others. The fact is that First Nations have not been seen as human beings for a very long time in this country, and have had laws and policies and practices that have aggressively sought just resources, removing First Nations to territories that are uninhabitable with a lack of livelihood, and then outright just left there to disappear or to, in the worst case scenario, to die. That's what Canada has done, and that's not an overstatement in any way. I mean, if you look at the ways in which there's back in the 1940s, 1950s, tuberculosis epidemics, or situations of lack of food. First Nations were often left out in those areas and the hopes of the Canadian government was that they would just disappear and they would cease to become an issue. In fact, many politicians, especially in the 1980s, called Indians a problem. And this is a problem to solve by the Canadian government. And the biggest solution was the exact same solution that people in areas across the world did with other ethnic populations they didn't want to deal with. They just sought to eradicate them through either starvation or, in some case, more aggressive means. This is a good example of, for a long period of time, First Nations have been left behind by everyone, the Canadian government, but the Canadian government represents everyone. That means you and me too. So that's on us. We have not spoken up enough. We have not voted in politicians enough. We have not kept this on our agenda enough to make sure that everybody in this country has just basic principles of life available to them. And so we could also talk about the other issues that First Nations have dealt with, because it's not just boil water advisories, it's also over-incarceration. It's also massive issues around cancers that are in communities in northern Manitoba, for example, where I am, not now, but where I typically am. There's communities that have experienced more cancer per population than anybody else because of the resources that have been used nearby and the waste that's been left behind and put into the water system, into the earth, into the air. And as a result, people get lung cancer or cervical cancer, or in the case of certain First Nations, like I believe it's Benobbani Cree Nation, there's children that have deformities that have nowhere else other than in places where there's nearby drilling for radioactive resources. So there's something happening in First Nations that certainly shows evidence of a very rare case that only comes from the development and the leaving behind and the treating people of less than human beings. So is this real? Yes, it is. It is absolutely real. And I encourage all of you to do your own research on not just the places that I've talked about, but look up boil water advisories, or look up over-policing, or look up the rate of cancer or diabetes on First Nations, or look up the rate of obesity. I'll say one more thing about obesity, I think is a good example. If you make First Nations communities so with a lack of infrastructure, let's say an airport, but they're a fly-in community, or so they can only have, let's say, a helicopter come in. or they have a fly-in community that you can only fly in during certain months of the year because the snow is too deep, or they don't have a bulldozer, or they don't have a decent ability to maintain their electricity, so they're constantly having their power run out. So what ends up happening is that that First Nation then does not get fresh food. And if they do get fresh food, it's so expensive because there's usually one store in town, and that store is usually run by a huge multinational corporation called the Northern Store. And the Northern Store realizes they have a monopoly in that First Nation, so therefore they charge $100 for a pound of meat, or $50 for a bushel of bananas. Nobody can afford that. And so what ends up happening is that people then choose lesser than options, chips, soft drinks, chocolate bars to eat because they're affordable. They'll make those affordable because the profit margin on a chocolate bar, let's say, is $10. But you might be able to get a larger profit margin on fresh food. So what ends up happening is that people become obese, they get diabetes, they develop thyroid conditions, they develop cholesterol issues, liver issues. And oh, by the way, they end up in hospitals because they have to be flown out of those communities to deal with dialysis, for example, or other issues involving insulin. They end up in cities which cost taxpayers, that's everybody, because of the chronic mistreatment of First Nations over the issue of food. So we can either deal with that issue by making more spaces in hospitals, or we can deal with that issue by refusing to let the Northern Store, which Stephen Harper, that federal government just a few decades ago, removed the protections for Northern First Nations so that the prices could be under control, so that they actually refused the Northern Store to increase their prices. And the fact is that when we just simply let corporations control what First Nations eat, or the price that they have to pay to eat, then what ends up happening is people end up in hospitals. They end up in massive situations of needing insulin and needing dialysis, needing new livers, etc. Okay. That's the first question. So we obviously took a little while with that question. I'll try not to be so long for all of them. So, second question is not any easier, but it is one that perhaps I can deal with more directly. Why do so many Indigenous women and girls go missing often? So the first question is really goes to the question we just asked. Why are Indigenous peoples treated less than everybody else? Why are they treated so badly? Why are they treated so neglectfully? Why is it that they are over-policed on one end, so that there's police in more First Nations, in more urban areas involving Indigenous peoples than almost anywhere else, which should deal with the issue of murdered missing Indigenous women and girls. But yet, when murdered missing Indigenous women and girls happen, nobody believes them. Those women are not searched for. And then they end up in chronic situations where they can be gone for a very long period of time, or labeled as transient. And therefore people go, oh, we don't need to look for them because they're off doing ABCD. Meanwhile, they're being the victims of a serial killer, like in Winnipeg, for example, where multiple Indigenous women and girls were preyed upon by an admitted serial killer. Well, he's not found guilty of serial killing yet, but he's admitted to killing multiple women, all in the span of about 2 to 3 months. So that's, I don't know what else you need for serial killing, but that's what the trial is going to be about. The verdict, by the way, is going to be on July 11th, so just in about a month from now. Why is it that this happens? Okay, so there's two parts. So the first is the main culprit. The main culprit of this is poverty. Poverty comes and puts women and men and boys and children and elders and everyone in situations of vulnerability. And because First Nations and First Nations lives have been chronically thrust into poverty by the federal government, notice I said thrust, pushed into, nobody chooses poverty. Like, nobody wakes up in the morning and says, oh, I really want to be poor today. Like, nobody chooses that. That's an imposed lifestyle. So that means that when people are waking up, for instance, they might be unemployed, they might be chronically undereducated, there might be situations of trauma where they can't work, where they have a mental health issue, or maybe they just don't have the skills necessary. They haven't had the exposure to the workforce. Whether that's on a First Nations or in an urban area, that comes from decades upon decades upon decades of imposed violence, going all the way back to the days of residential schools. So residential schools created a chronic undereducating in our community, so that, and also a great deal of trauma when it came to education. And so that means that trauma then came home to families and communities. That meant that in certain families, there might be instances of abuse, or there might be instances of experience with institutions that are mistrustful, or that might be the situation involving if your parent never finished school, why would they want you to finish school? Or why would they want you to go to school if they had been abused in that place? So there's those issues, right? There's those issues of chronic decades upon decades of trauma in relation to schooling. And then on top of that, that might be involving situations of employment. Never mind the fact that there is no employment on a First Nation other than the basics involving governance, the chief and council, those are very limited positions. Or there might be a few private businesses like the gas station or convenience store of some kind, or let's say some kind of office of something. But generally what happens is, because of the Indian Act, there is no ability for First Nations to be able to create, oh, not sure what happened there. There is no ability of First Nations to be able to create their own employment. And so that means that the Indian Act bans businesses or private businesses. So there's the second part of it. There is the same kind of chronic neglect or willful ignorance that is within every Canadian. So every single Canadian has been taught that Indigenous peoples are less than them. They've been taught that Indigenous peoples are problems, and then that Indigenous peoples are always out to get something that's different, or give something that's special, or we've been taught that Indigenous peoples are constant problems. Remember what I said before, is that they're problems in society. And the solution, of course, is Canadians, that Canadians have to solve this problem in some way. So as a result, what happens is that when Indigenous peoples go missing, they aren't believed when their family calls the police, for example, or their friends call the police. And that Canadians go, well, we have the idea. We know that this person is involved in the sex work, for example, or they're involved in a high dangerous occupation, let's say carrying drugs or something like that. Or let's just say that they are a person who's vulnerable, person who is, let's say, in a situation involving living in an encampment, for example. So what the police will say, or what Canadian politicians or leaders or crown attorneys or social workers will say, is they'll be like, oh, well, that person lives in a transient lifestyle. Totally absent of the context that that has been something that's been imposed. People did not choose that life, and therefore should they get extra consideration. Oh no, none of that matters. They're in the most dangerous lifestyle. They've chosen that lifestyle. They don't deserve the extra looks that we give. And then what ends up happening is that becomes a chronic problem within the system by multiple people. We'll say police, we'll say social workers. It's almost like everybody conspired without talking, but everybody kind of went, well, Indigenous women and girls, they don't deserve to be looked for. They don't matter. They are up to no good, or they choose terrible lifestyles, make terrible choices. And so then therefore what happens is it becomes a chronic problem, chronic problem, chronic problem. And the result of that is a serial killer. That's as simple as it gets. It's poverty and good old-fashioned imposed, learnt racism that every Canadian carries, whether they know it or not. And now you might be saying to yourself, well, Niigaan, I'm not racist. All of us are taught an imposed racism. And the imposed racism is that Canadians are civilized, problem solvers, superior, and that Indigenous peoples are inferior, problems, and then therefore need to be solved in some way, or need their decisions to be made for them. We'll call that paternalism. And that's what ends up happening in the situation of murder missing Indigenous women and girls. Okay, well, that's a bit of a dark answer to that question. And so that's a good question as to why. We haven't really talked about what to do about it. So I'll just briefly speak about what to do about this issue. So we had an inquiry of murder missing Indigenous women and girls. There's 231 calls for justice. So I invite you to read all of those. The first and most important is to recognize that a genocide is taking place right now. A genocide is when people have a mental intent and a physical intent to create harm. So clearly there's a physical intent by just neglect, by just certain police forces aggressively seeking to arrest people instead of helping them. There's lots of different ways that we can see physical intent. The mental intent is perhaps the hardest thing for people to understand. It is hard for Canadians to understand, all Canadians, newcomers, people who have been here for the first time, people who have been here for multiple generations. It's hard for Canadians to accept that they grew up learning racism, or that they are immersed in a racist society, or that they have continued to perpetrate or perpetuate policies and ideas of racism. And that's hard. And that's what my job is. My job is to help people to see that what they have learned is inherently wrong. And it is, while benefiting great amounts of people, resulting in beautiful homes and beautiful cities and beautiful resources, that there have been a group of people, several groups of people, hundreds of thousands, millions of people who have been left behind intentionally, violently, and that continue to be ostracized and marginalized to the point where we are witnessing a genocide in front of us. And that's what the inquiry invited us to do. It invited us to see a genocide that is taking place that is most deeply impacting Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit peoples, also youth, who are at the fringes and they are the most left behind. All Indigenous peoples are being left behind by development and have been for decades. But women, girls, Two-Spirit peoples, children, they're the ones who experience the most amount of it. And we know that from any conflict in the world, it is those people who suffer the most. Getting back to the issue of the Middle East, for example, that's precisely the people who are suffering the most. Okay, let's get to the third question. Okay, as newcomer ambassadors at our school, welcoming new students, often in the first language of the students, what can we say to them to increase awareness of First Nations, their achievements, culture, and struggles? Okay, so I'll give you three things that you can do. Learn Indigenous languages, so how to say hello or how are you in your local Indigenous language. Teach others about that, and you do that by using it and saying that it's valuable and it's important and it matters. Here, I always tell students, greet people in as many languages as you can. Greet people in the ways in which you too would like to be greeted and seen and recognized. Second is every time you do anything in your school or anything in achieving wise, let's say you make a wall of Canadian heroes or people who are heroes in our community, always make sure that there is First Nations in there and do it according to the national average. So that means 1 in 20. If you're in Manitoba, it would be 1 in 5. So that means 1 out of every 20 things should be Indigenous. And this is a basic way to start. So if you have 20 people, make sure that 1 of them is Indigenous. I would like you to do more, of course, maybe make 3 or 4 or 5. But if you start with the national average, which we make up 5% of the national population, then you can start. You can start to see what that change looks like. Because at one time, we were the majority. And due to policies, practices, and the fact that people have brought people here from all places of the world, we are all here because of Indigenous peoples. So I think we should go the extra mile. We should say it's important to recognize Indigenous peoples and spend the time necessary to be thankful for that. That's what we do with them. We do a territorial acknowledgement. We're thankful. We're also recognizing, we're seeing. And when you see, you have to teach people not to unsee, because they've been taught, they will be taught by their textbooks, sometimes by their teachers, sometimes by what songs we sing or what policies we use, or who do we hold up on these walls of heroes. We'll be taught not to see. Just turn on any movie or any TV show, which you'll be like, is this not really about Canada? Because there's no Indigenous peoples at all on this movie or in this TV show or in this news program. You might say to yourself, well, that's weird, because Indigenous peoples, at least at minimum, would make up 1/20th of all of our stories, minimum. But yet, if you could watch entire Canadian shows, movies, newspapers, you could, and go, there are no Indigenous peoples here. So you'll be taught not to see. So your job is to teach people to see. And here's the third thing that you can do. Don't just talk about struggles, talk about achievements. And that's why I think that you've listed both here. You've said achievements and struggles. It's not your job to teach culture. That's what Indigenous peoples should be doing. Indigenous peoples should be talking about our cultures. So we should be stepping aside and standing beside Indigenous people. So thrust Indigenous peoples, when they are willing, into leadership positions to share with you their aspects of their experience, and the culture will be discussed. But the second is focus on achievements. And what I always say is, when I teach an Indigenous studies class, I teach Canadians to be Canadian. That's really what I do. Meaning that they have to understand that Canada is an Indigenous word. Every single policy and practice, every single highway, every single road comes because of Indigenous peoples. Every single resource is because of our partnership, or lack thereof, with Indigenous communities. That means everything in Canada starts with Indigenous peoples, period. It does not start with British or French people or any other nation. It starts with Indigenous peoples. And then, of course, if you talk about Indigenous peoples, then you have to talk about the land, and you have to talk about the water, because Indigenous peoples will be the first people to tell you that they're only here because of the animals, the birds, the fish, and the birds and fish and animals are only there because of the water and the plants and the earth. And then, of course, those things are only there because of the sky, of the stars, of the planet, of creation, of the universe, of the creator. As you can start to see how when you recognize Indigenous peoples, you're actually recognizing everybody. That's just a good way to think about it, is that when you recognize and you work with recognizing Indigenous peoples and their achievements, that means you'll start to see not only that we are amazing Olympians, we've also given everybody all the food, the trading routes, the policies and practices like multiculturalism, democracy, free speech. These all come from Indigenous ideas. None of these were European ideas at the start. And so then what you realize is that everything around us is because of Indigenous peoples, and we start there. Now, did Europeans have something important to say? For sure. Did people from the Philippines and from Africa and from America and from Latin America, do all these people come here and do important things? Absolutely. We should be very proud of all of them, like Donovan Bailey, or what's her name? Christine Sinclair, or the amazing Michelle Jean, the Governor General, like Adrian Clarkson. They're amazing people who do amazing things in this place, but they are only doing amazing things because it is Indigenous peoples that we begin with. So it's important to start with all of those things. And so start everything with a concept of, we'll start with what is the conversation involving Indigenous peoples. And what you realize is that everything that we are the most proudest of in this country is because of our relationships with Indigenous peoples. Okay, number 4. What activities should we promote at a TRC club at our school? This one is easy. I always think that what you should do is take the TRC calls to action. There's 94 of them, and commit to one of those, let's say a week, or commit to one of those a month, or commit to doing, let's say, 5 of those over a year. And what you'll notice is that some of them are very big. Like, for example, how do we get a pope to apologize like he did in 2022? But that's a call to action. It's about working with your local Catholic churches to help them to understand that the apology doesn't just need to come from a pope, it needs to come from all elements of the church, and building healthy relationships between Indigenous communities and the church is an ongoing process, not a one-time event. And so that could be something that you adopt. It also could be something that you adopt to say calls to action 1 through 5, which is around child welfare, and saying to yourself, well, we want to deal with this issue by inviting kids in the child welfare system to come for a pancake breakfast, or kids who have been impacted by having a lack of contact with their communities due to being in the child welfare system. We want to build some project or fundraise to allow people to be able to have those experiences of traveling to their First Nation, whatever. Adopt a TRC call to action, do 5 of them, let's say, over the next year. Or try 1 a week or 1 a month, or, I realize that the TRC club may not be something that's mandatory in your school, which I think is a problem. I think every single school should be teaching the TRC calls to action in every class, science and math in particular. And if we were to start to do that, we might start to talk about the term reconciliation. Okay, now number 5 is a little bit related. Sometimes people we speak to about decolonization and the 94 calls to action say to us that as newcomers, it is not their problem. What suggestions do you have for when we encounter these kinds of attitudes? Well, when newcomers come to this place, they come off the plane, let's say, or they arrive in a boat, or they travel across the United States border. The second you arrive, within milliseconds of entering into this space, or the mere sake of even just hearing about this space, you are hearing about Indigenous peoples. You are experiencing benefits according to your relationships with Indigenous nations. You are only here because of relationships with Indigenous peoples who formed the treaties that welcomed all the newcomers in. I don't care if it's newcomers in 1870 in Manitoba, which was the Manitoba Act. 1871 is Treaty 1, which welcomed the newcomers in, which were at that point becoming Canadians or British North Americans. I don't care if it's 1871 or it's 2024. You are here because of treaty. So you are here because of your relationships with Indigenous peoples, period. That's as simple as it is, which is, I don't care if you're here for 10 minutes or you're here for 10 years or 100 years or 110 years. I don't care. You are a treaty person. You are here because of Indigenous peoples. And so the 94 calls to action, like, you don't just get to cherry pick the good stuff. You don't get to go like, oh, well, we have beautiful highways here, or we have a tremendous ability for me to be able to get a job here, or I can walk down the street and not have to worry about there being people who will shoot at me here. The fact is that all of that is because of Indigenous peoples. It is Indigenous peoples who started these ideas of peace, justice, kindness, and that Canadians later took those ideas and then made this country on top of those Indigenous principles. And unfortunately, Indigenous peoples did not benefit from those principles, because then they were ostracized, put to the side onto reserves, and then left behind out of the economy. We talked about that with the first answer with Neskatanga. So, it only comes from ignorance or a misunderstanding of what Canada is. It makes sense. I think immigrants or people who are new to this place have been taught not to see. They've been taught that Canadians are the only ones who matter. They've been taught that the only way to live is to have a willful ignorance and racism towards Indigenous peoples. And so that takes a long time to detract, to deconstruct, and to engage. It doesn't happen easily, but it really happens through empathy, happens through kindness. It happens through realizing that it's not Canada that brought people to peace, justice, and fairness in this place. It's Indigenous peoples. And that Indigenous peoples are the reason that people have a place to go when their country's in civil war. They have a place to go when they have a lack of opportunity or they want to travel, or that it is Indigenous peoples that give people these vast chances to live in a place that is very beautiful, that has wonderful trees and water and medicines and earth and animals, and it is Indigenous peoples that are the reason for those things. And I would actually say even deeper, it's the reason that Indigenous peoples learn those things are from the earth, from the plant, from the plants, from the animals, the trees, um, the fish, the birds, all of those things. And it is Indigenous peoples who can help us to recognize those things. Much like I'm going to do very soon in the lodge that I'm going to this morning, where we will spend our time reflecting upon our relationships with earth and sky and water. Okay. In 2016, this is question number 6. In 2016, there were 58 Indigenous restorative justice programs in Ontario. Besides completely overhauling the Canadian justice system, what other solutions can be implemented to reduce the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the Canadian justice system? So again, it's impossible for me to give these full answers because there are many different reports. So I've already said the Murdered Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, 231 calls for justice. I've mentioned the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 94 calls to action. Now, what I'll do is I'll invite this person to realize that there are many, many solutions. There are many, many reports. This is the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. Just look up the section called Justice. There's also a thing called that my father participated, which was an analysis of Manitoba, but is 100% applicable to Ontario. And that's the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. And there are hundreds of recommendations in that report. So you can't fix a broken system. Like imagine if you tried to fix a system by, or a car, let's say a car. So you've got a car that's broken down. You don't just keep using the same materials to fix that broken car because it's broken. So like you can't take a broken engine and then just use a broken engine to fix a broken engine. What you need is new parts, new ideas, innovative creativity. That's what you need, those things. And so that's usually, sometimes you might need a whole new engine. Sometimes you might need tools that you've never seen before. Sometimes you might need a new approach or someone to come in with expertise that you don't have. That's what all of these reports invite people to do. So it's not just about restorative justice, although that's important. Restorative justice is the idea that victimry or crime is shared. Also, solutions are shared. That means that we come together as a community and don't just talk about the harm, but also talk about why the harm occurred, how to make sure the harm doesn't reoccur, and then therefore, what are the solutions that we need collectively as a community to all work together, all be on the same page, to commit to make sure that the harm is not repeated and that those who are the harmer and those who've been impacted by the harm somehow can live together. Okay, I'm going to leave that answer right there. I hope that what I've done is I've suggested that there are lots of different ways to see this. And I think I've realized that I'm not going to get to all 20. I'm going to get to probably, if I'm lucky, 15, but we'll see. I believe that the impact is the land acknowledgement is diminishing. It has become expected. How can we move forward from the land acknowledgement in a way that is impactful for individuals, organizations, and the community? Okay, there's another question that I'm not going to quite get to. So we'll just join this one with number 8, which is what's the difference between a territorial acknowledgement and a land acknowledgement? So this would answer number 7. A territorial acknowledgement is a better way to think about things than a land acknowledgement because we're not acknowledging the land, we're acknowledging the relationships on the land. So the land is a part of that, but it's not the only part. So if we're to just say that we have a nice relationship with the tree, that doesn't mean that we don't recognize that we have spaces, we have relationships in a space that might result in the harming of that tree, even if I acknowledge that tree outright. So that means we have to think about things in terms of territory. Like, what is on a territory? It's not just the earth, it's also the water, it's also the birds, it's also human beings and their relationships between, let's say, Indigenous nations and Canada, as an example. So I want us to think about things in terms of territorial acknowledgements, not land acknowledgements. This is like almost like splitting hairs, but I would just say it's a very important determination, because we're not just recognizing land, we're recognizing the relationships on that land, with that land, because of that land. Now, it's becoming diminishing because people just repeat it, right? Imagine if you said every day to your partner, I'm married to you. I'm married to you. I'm your parent. I live with you. Like, if you just said it every single day, you just repeated it every single day, it doesn't mean anything. But if you say, I am married to you because of, I am your parent because of, I am your partner because of, and then just explain why. It would become much more meaningful, because I love you, because I'm committed to you, because I am working constantly to learn from you. Like, try that, do that at dinner sometime. Turn to the person that you live with and explain to them why it is that you are in relationship to them. Explain to them why that you love them. Explain to them what it means to be in living with them in a house. It means that I get to see you every day, the most beautiful being I've ever seen in my life. You are everything that I ever dreamed that I could live with. And notice how meaningful it becomes. That's the problem with territorial acknowledgements, when they're just repeated. They don't have any personality, they don't have any personal relationship, they don't have any meaning behind it. I want us to put meaning always in every territorial acknowledgement that we make. So when you say a territorial acknowledgement, say what it means to you. Say, I want to recognize that I am in relationship with these Indigenous nations, and I commit to the earth and the water. And here's what that means to me. That means that I am here because of my relationship with Indigenous nations, even though I may not have known that in the past. So I strive to become better, or I strive to become a better Canadian, which inherently means that I understand my relationships with Indigenous peoples. And I commit to always recognizing and showing love for that reason. Okay, number 9. Have you ever planted a garden the Three Sisters way or seen it grow? We've read about it. I have not planted it myself, but I have witnessed it. I have gone to gardens where I've seen it and seen the way the plants grow together and protect one another. I would have much more experience with sunflowers, being a person from the Interlake here in Manitoba. Manitoba produces about 90% of the sunflowers in Canada. And so I would say I've seen more about sunflowers than I have with Three Sisters, which would be more of an Ontario thing. It happens a little bit in Manitoba, but it would happen much more in the territory that you are. So yes, I have. And I've seen the ways in which those plants protect one another. The amazing thing about nature is that nature gives us all the teachings that we need to know about how to live together. Like, nature's already thought of it. They've already worked out those problems. But sometimes we as human beings like to be antithetical, or swim upstream, as I say. Like, the very teachings are in front of us. If we look to let's say these trees that I'm looking at right now, or the water, or the plants, or the birds, they all can teach us about how to live together, work together, benefit from each other. But we just ignore it, or we just pretend like it's not happening. And then we say, oh, let's try this other thing over here. Let's make a bunch of concrete and separate ourselves from the earth, and think that we're somehow better than the earth. The fact is that if we lived according to the earth, we'd be a lot more sustainable. We would still have a lot of the things that we have and we benefit from, but we would not be facing a climate crisis right now, or the lack of resources, or leave people behind. All the solutions are in the world around us. We just choose not to see them. Okay, number 10. I'm halfway through your book. Miigwech for buying my book. For those of you who don't know, I just put out a book called Winnipeg, Visions of Canada from an Indigenous Center. Can you please tell us about Mama Bear Clan Patrol and your work with them? Oh, that's great. Mama Bear Clan is an organization that started about 6 years ago through the North Point Douglas Women's Center by grandmothers in the North Point Douglas community, one of the poorest communities in Canada. They were responding to an issue of domestic problems in the area. So these are children that were not being cared for or that were somehow experiencing some kind of neglect, oftentimes not due to violence, but due to overworking of parents, or sometimes those children would go into a park and find needles in that place. So we need to clean up the neighborhood to give them safe places to play. And so anyways, the grandmothers all responded to that by creating the Mama Bear Clan Patrol, which was to clean up the neighborhood, which was to provide safe spaces and a patrol and supervisory abilities for ways in which children could come to somebody in the streets if they needed assistance, or just somebody safe to be around for a little while, or they needed someone to keep an eye and to support them. And it's a way to create presence. It's a way to create ways in which citizens look after each other. We don't need police to do that or paramedics to do that all the time. We need neighborhoods to take care of neighborhoods. And then it also provided the ability for people outside of the neighborhood to help, to offer assistance and their abundance of resources and wealth, and to bring that to the North Point Douglas community, which was a neglected area. Probably the most important thing with the Mama Bear Clan, though, is to do what the bear does, which is to show love to creation, to show love to itself through medicine picking, but then also sharing that medicine with others. One thing about a bear, is a bear will patrol and will keep an eye on an area so that area is completely safe because it's governed by the principles of that bear, which is to make sure that everybody shows respect. And that's what that bear does when it marks a tree and patrols in a territory. And so bears also make sure that medicine is something that is available to all, because when it digs up the medicine for itself, it also leaves that medicine available for other beings to be able to partake in that medicine, particularly bear root, which is found often in swamps or near waterways. Helps with indigestion, also helps with childbirth, also helps with blood circulation. So that medicine is something that bears share with everybody. And that's why the Mama Bear Clan Patrol exists. It does the same principles today. Okay, I'm going to do this last question. Unfortunately, I only got to 11 because I have to head over to the ceremony grounds in about 16 minutes. And we're about 10 minutes away. So I'm going to just finish off with this question here. I did the best I could, Joan, with the question that you sent over. So maybe what we could do is we could pick this up maybe in another series or another set of questions. Number 11, who are the influences in your life and who are the influences now? The most important influence in my life is probably my grandfather, even though I had a very short period of time with him. My grandfather, whose name is Henry, I grew up with him. He was a very kind man, very complicated man. He was a very violent man for a long time and was not nice to my father, who I would say was my also most important influence. Those two men were not easy all the time to learn from and to spend time with. But I love both of them more than anything in the world. My grandfather particularly, because he taught me love. He taught me about what it means to commit to another person. And while he spent most of his life in a deep, dire state of alcoholism, he quit when I was born because of my father. And because of that, I learned nothing but love from my grandfather. He loved me innately. And that's what I try to do in my work. I try to show love to everybody. I try to show love to the people that I work with, like yourselves. I also try to show love in the kindness that I give to people, but also the kindness that I show to myself. And so to care for myself so that I can care well for others. That is what I learned from my father, which is that my father is a person who embodied that love. And I've modeled myself after seeing that love. In many ways, my father has been as much a father to the country as he's been to me and to my siblings. And so my father has been a real model, and I've learned a lot from my father about what it means to be a person to do this work. It means to be a person who shares themselves, and also what it means to bring our teachings as Anishinaabe people to the country. And so I've learned a lot from my father. I would say that those two people were my most primary influences. And but as I get older, I'm now 48. I would say that the influence of my mother is probably the most profound. My mother, and I'm lucky enough to have two mothers, so I would say both of them in various different ways. My mother, which is my father's second wife, she has given me the ability to be proud of who I am, but also be mindful that to be careful and to be gentle, and to always be in process, to always work on yourself, and to always realize that you don't know it all. And I think that that's something that she's always given to me. I've never met a person who is so profoundly wise as my mother, and that I always know that she cares very deeply, even though sometimes it's hard to hear from the words that she says. My other person is my biological mother, and she is a French Canadian Catholic woman, and she she's been there my whole life, even when my father had some difficulty and was gone for a long period of my life. My mother was always there. So what I learned from her is absolute and innate commitment that the real work that people make with each other is how they stay in a room together, how they figure each other out, regardless of the differences. And it often works by a phrase that she uses, which is whatever works. So her favorite phrase is whatever works. And one thing that I think is one of my best traits, which is that I take from my mother. The more that I work in my life, and the more that I become a parent, the more that I write books, the more that I try my best to navigate this world, it is that finding the paths to work together is whatever works. And uh, whatever works doesn't mean we just give up our values. In fact, it means we double down on our values. It means that we figure out what the important values are, the most critical values are, and that we bring those to the table. And our job is to take these two things that seem very antithetical and just find ways for them to maintain each other's integrity. That's what I think the goal of my mother has always been, is to double down on your beliefs, to never compromise on the things that matter the most to you, and to make sure, though, that you don't give up on those who are doing also the same thing, that are bringing their values to you. And your job is to now figure out ways that you can both maintain your integrity with each other. So I apologize that I didn't get to everything. And but there is one more question here that I see, so maybe I'll address this one. It says, we've heard about reconciliation a lot. Why don't we hear as much about it now, and what does it mean to you? Well, reconciliation has been this series. And reconciliation has been us spending time together, breaking bread together, and food together, sharing food together. Reconciliation has been Joan working in your center. And it's not easy. It sometimes comes with conflict. Most oftentimes it comes with a lot of disagreement, but it's figuring out a way to both share that space and at the end of the day, call each other brother and sister, or cousin, or friends today, family tomorrow. Because we know that when friends stay friends long enough, they eventually become family. And that's what reconciliation really means. It means that just don't give up on one another. Keep at it. There's a reason that our ancestors agreed to these things called treaties. And it wasn't to stay committed for a weekend. It was supposed to be staying committed forever. The purpose of treaty was for our children, our grandchildren, to eventually marry, and that way we wouldn't have war, because you would never war against your own relative. Quickly makes me think about other things and other conflicts in the world. Maybe sometimes you do war with your relatives, but even if you do war with them, you still have to face them the next day or the next year or the next decade. You're going to have to eventually figure out a way to live together, because we also know that family conflicts are some of the most brutal. And so maybe that's the time period that we're in. Maybe the time period that we're in is that we've forgotten that teaching. Maybe we need to remember that teaching and work on it, because that's what reconciliation ultimately will mean. I actually think that we hear about reconciliation more than ever, because what's happening is that it's becoming a part of a normalized conversation. It's also something that we can't turn back the clock on. We can't turn it off now. The faucet cannot be turned off. The can cannot be closed. Reconciliation, because of the past decade or so, because of the heavy lifting that has been done by activists. I actually think Idle No More was that tipping point that led to a change in government, that led to the most progressive government, federal government in history, which is Justin Trudeau's government. Good, bad, great, ugly. I'm just telling you that there have been more legislation passed. There's more discussion around reconciliation and rights than ever before, and you can't just turn it off. I don't care what the next government is. I don't care if it's Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, or if it's Jagmeet Singh and the NDP, or Elizabeth May and the Greens, or a new Liberal leader. I don't care who it is. You can't turn it off now. It's too far down the path, and you can be aggressive. And other than the fact that I think Canadians would not tolerate the turning back of certain rights and areas of reconciliation, you may be able to turn some, or stunt the growth of some of the changes that have been taking place, but you can't erase it. Not in the way that we were about a decade ago, where there was outright ignorance, outright denial, outright willful mistrust and violence taking place. I think you can't do those things anymore. I think you can't simply just the youth. The real confidence that I have is like people like my daughter and her generation. All of them are ready for the massive changes necessary for not just reconciliation, but also climate change, massive escalating conflict in this country, or the fact that young people realize that capitalism is an endgame that results in the death of all of us. And those young people, I think, are more cognizant and aware than we have ever been. And I have confidence in them. So we may not think that reconciliation is not happening amongst our generation, those who are older, but amongst young people, this is just how they talk. It's just inherently a part of every conversation. And you hear that by them talking more about inclusivity, talking more about civility, or talking more about how do the people listen to each other and work together, even in platforms like social media and TikTok and all this kind of stuff. Like, they're figuring it out. And so I think that I have confidence as much in them as perhaps I do of us. And at the North York Community House, through this series, through your work of Joan and others who are working in the area of reconciliation, I'm thinking about all those students who did that amazing project on murder, missing Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit peoples. I'm thinking about all those different people that I've met along the way, including my young brother who comes from Manitoba First Nation, I believe it was Long Plain. And so I'm thinking about all the people that I've met over the past year. Like, you can't turn it off now. It's too far. The wave is too strong now. And so we can try to stop it, or others can try to stop it. But I think that we've committed to each other in ways in which our ancestors would be very proud of us. And change doesn't happen overnight. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So, okay, so it's pretty good. I got to half. So, and we've been together for about an hour. So I want to say a big miigwech to all of you. I want to give my love to all of you and big wishes. And I hope that I see you all in the new year. I think we're talking about doing a new series over in the North York Community House. I'm certainly traveling a lot next year. I will probably be able to do as many as I've done this year, but I'll be able to come by a few times. So big miigwech, and thanks to all of you. And I have to head over to ceremonies now. So miigwech, take care, everybody.